Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast. And in this webcast we're going to talk about how can you call an external API from a SharePoint Framework solution securely. Essentially, how can you in the easiest possible way have an external API as a web API or Azure Function as an example, and Azure Functions endpoint, which you can call in a secured way from a SharePoint Framework solution, typically from a client-side web part, but in the future from other types as well. My name is Esa Juvonen. I'm a senior program manager from the SharePoint engineering, and with me today as the, let's say, the demo god is Waldek Mastergaard once again. Waldek, will you do quick intros as well?
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Waldek Mastergaard. I work at Encore. I am Office Development MVP. And today I am far from being demo god. I am demo slave, and I actually hope that demo gods will work with us. And I will be able to show you how you can really easily call a secure API, and an API secured with AAD in secured way from SPFX without using AWS.
Yes, and that's really the key point what Waldek was saying. So yes, we do have existing samples on the SharePoint Framework documentation how to call a web API in secure way using AWS. But there's a challenge around that one, and let's talk about actually those challenges in the following slides as well. So there we go. So what are those challenges related on AWS from SharePoint Framework? Now, AWS requires an application to be created in Azure AD and a specific authorization to be completed. And what this means is that if you're using the AWS as your flow and a model to make these things happen, you will need to sign in explicitly or authorize the application when you're actually starting to use that. And from an end user perspective, that's not really that optimal, because what it means is that you need to first click a login button in the web part, even though the web part is hosted in SharePoint Online. And then you need to do the authorization flow, and then you're good to go of executing the web API. So not a super optimal thing.
Yeah, and the one thing that I wanted to ask you about it. So what if I had 3 web parts on a page? Does that mean that I would have to sign in each one of them separately?
Well, technically, yes, because all of those web parts are own applications. And that would actually then open up an additional set of challenges as well.
Yeah, cool.
And one of the key challenges around the AWS is also the fact that you will need to know the reply URLs. Because when you fall back from the AWS, when you're using AWS, your process being redirected to this another URL where you authorize, then the Azure AD is throwing you back on the URL where you continue using the original application. And that works well in the context of, let's say, a single page application, which is an isolated application hosted in Azure. But it doesn't work really that well in the context of SharePoint, because in SharePoint, typical scenarios would be a custom web parts, which are randomly here and there in your portal. So well, even though technically you could actually redirect the person back on the welcome page of the portal, but if the same web part is used in multiple locations, that would actually get super complex. And there's a maximum 10 reply URLs for each Azure AD application. So it would be super complex to actually configure and keep up with the functionalities or keep up with the instances of those web parts in the SharePoint portal side. So that's not really optimal scenario. That's not really acceptable scenario. Anything you want to add in here, actually, Waldek, on this discussion?
Being creative, I can imagine that you could come up with a solution that you would redirect back to the home page, and you would keep track of from which page the user came, and then redirect them back. But that would be really complex thing to maintain, to keep track, to do it properly.
True.
And actually, the best part is there is a simpler way to do all of this without ADAL, right? So we can there is another tool in our box that we can use.
Yes, absolutely. And let's talk about that one as well before we go to the demo. So alternative way to securely call APIs secured with Azure AD. So how we're doing this is that we essentially take advantage of the authentication which is happening already in SharePoint. So we're using this iframe, which is pointing to the API page within the which is hosted in the external location, like in the Azure Web Application or Azure Function as well. So essentially, what will happen is that iframe is used to authenticate the user automatically against the Azure AD. Because when you're signing to SharePoint Online, you are actually authenticating against Azure AD as well. The outgoing web requests, whenever you're calling from a SharePoint Framework solution, those outgoing web requests must send credentials across the domain, which is understandable as well, because if you don't send the credentials, how could that call be authenticated? So if you send the credentials, then the external web API or the web API hosted in Azure Web Application or the Azure Function can actually authenticate the person. And then on the other side, in the Azure side, in this scenario, and also in the demo scenario, the API must accept credentials from a cross-domain call. So you need to do some level of a configuration there to make all of this happens as well. And for all of this, we have a tutorial available, and we also have a sample available which is showing how to make these things actually work. Anything about I want to add here, Waldek, before we go to the demo?
Yeah, there's an interesting thing that you have to keep in mind, and that was actually the same thing applied to ADAL. If you work in Internet Explorer, there's a thing called zones. Security zones.
Yes.
Zones, yeah. And in ADAL, there was the issue that the Azure AD login page had to be in the same zone as your tenant, because otherwise credentials wouldn't be sent across between the iframe, or ADA would not be able to access the iframe and communicate with AD through the iframe. And exactly the same thing applies here, because we still use the iframe, right? Yep. So you still need to be, all of that still needs to work, because otherwise it will be blocked.
Yeah, and really, and that's absolutely a great point, and that's a limitation in Internet Explorer which you need to consider. Now, all of these scenarios which we're showing in this webcast are mainly for the enterprise development scenarios. And when you are doing an enterprise development scenario, you can easily use a group policy as an example to make sure that the logging pages are in the same secured zone as the SharePoint Online. So that's not really unnecessarily a major deal, or we can solve the challenge for Internet Explorer as well if you're using IE. Really, before we go to the demo, one of the key, let's say, differences using this approach with ADL.js is that this will make you or enable you to call the web API in a secured way, but it doesn't actually authorize you. So it doesn't actually have that same authorization scheme, authorization process as with ADL.js, where the application is requesting certain permissions against your identity, and then you grant those permissions. This model only works essentially for authentication. And what it means is that within the endpoint, within the API side, you do not have access tokens for certain operations, which obviously is a limiting factor. But if you're using, for example, web or app only to access SharePoint Online, that's one option. Or you can use the identity of the person to filter what's being shown and what's being actually performed in the web API level.
And then another thing I think that we should name is the fact that in this approach, you don't need to create an AAD app for your web part.
Yes.
And with that, you don't need to deal with reply URLs, keeping track of where the web part is being used, worrying about the limit of maximum of 10 URLs. You can just add the web part to the page, and it will work. It will just work.
Yes, indeed. And now we're actually making kind of a awesome promises on the process and the model itself. So let's actually have a look on this one in practice. So let's flip on Waldek's computer, walk through the simplistic scenario what we have prepared for the demo, which is super simplistic, but that's for a reason as well. So we're concentrating on showing you how to make this happen. Then it's up to you on the amount of innovation you want to actually build on top of this. But I think the scenario itself is super important. This is like the holy grail of enterprise development within a SharePoint framework. And let's come back on the scenarios and opportunities around this one after the demo as well. But let's flip on the demo and come back on the slides in a second.
All right. So in this demo, I'd like to show you how you can call an API secured with AAD from a SharePoint Framework client-side web part without ADAL. So here we have the web part in Workbench, and that's the Workbench hosted in SPO, so that I am already logged in, I have cookie and all that, and I am actually allowed to call the API. And here you see a greeting, and this part comes actually from the API. So if I refresh the page, you will, for a really short time, see a loading text, and then after that, you will see a greeting. So 3, 2, yep.
Please.
5. Yeah. So it was really fast.
and in this case, obviously, the API call is so fast. But if the API call would take a while, if you would call against on-premises or in a larger system or a SQL database in Azure, that might take a few seconds or whatever. So it would actually show the loading part.
Well, and actually, the best part is that this is a video, so you can pause, you can go frame by frame, make it really long, and actually seeing that there is a loading text.
Yes, that's true. That is absolutely true.
Right, and this is just to give you the proof that the API that we're calling here is actually an API secured with AAD. Let me grab the URL, open that in a new window in private, and when I try to access the API, I will get a login page. So this is actually an API secured with AAD that I cannot access anonymously.
Yeah.
So with that proof, let's have a quick look at the API. The API that I have is an Azure function that I implemented here, and it's really simple, right? Because the whole idea here is not to show a fancy thing that does search or perform some line of business logic. You can implement that part by yourself. The key is, how can you enable a function to be able to be called by a SharePoint Framework client-side web part without ADAL? So the key part are actually the headers, right? So that's one. That's one element that you have to have in place. The first one that you have to have is this guy here, which basically says that this function is capable to accept credentials coming from cross-domain calls. And that's important because the function is actually hosted on another host than our intranet, right? Because that lives in Azure, whereas the Workbench that we call it from lives in SPO, right? So that's one. Another one is for this part to work. Another thing that you have to enable is CORS. But the trick here is that you cannot use a star. You cannot simply allow all external hosts to call the API. You have to have the exact list of all hosts that are allowed to call it, right? So then that's another thing.
And that's absolutely fine, because in the enterprise scenario where the scenario would be actually used and then where it's actually targeted, you technically and typically have a one tenant or few tenants, which would be the URLs which you enable in here.
Absolutely. And then another part that you have to add are the options that the API accepts, right? So the methods, which are the get, post, and options here, but it could either be get or post, or depending on what your API does. And then also we have the headers for the list of the headers that we support, and the amount of time for which we cache the response, right? Or we allow the response to be cached. So these are the key parts. Now, other things that you have to keep in mind for this to work specifically to functions is that, first of all, the function is anonymous, right? Because when you build an Azure function, you have an option to make it anonymous. You have the option to secure it with a key or an admin key, right? So in that thing, we set it to anonymous. And then another thing is that we secure the function using Azure App Service auth. And that's an option basically. If we go to the function here, which is the one here, the function app, here is the auth option, and in here you can see that that is enabled to on. It is set to prompt for AAD auth whenever you are anonymous, and here there is also the AAD enabled, which basically uses or points to my AAD app used to secure the function with AAD. So that's a typical thing that you have to do for an API, right?
So let's actually walk with that one more time. So now that we are using Azure functions in the demo scenario, what you still need to have is an Azure AD application or a web application which is associated to the Azure AD and an Azure AD application.
Yes.
Or no,
yeah,
well, let's just rephrase that. You need to have an Azure AD application in Azure AD, which is essentially where you're associating this.
Yeah, and that is basically nothing else than entry in your AAD saying this is entity, known entity that you want to secure with AAD.
Yes.
Right? There is nothing more to it. All right, so with that in place, we have the API part covered.
Actually, Waldek, one more time, can we actually go one step back, because this is already an advanced page. Where did we get to this? Where did we see the, if we go to the function itself, just making sure that we're getting that one properly covered. So authentication in the configured features, and in here, yes. This is already associated. So we were extending, that page is already showing the application where it's being associated, right?
Yes, yeah, because that is within the context of the function app that you use.
Yes,
right?
Correct.
All right. So with that, the last part is, how do we actually call that in a secure way from the web part without ADAL?
Yeah.
So let's switch to the code. And there are a few parts that you have to have here in place. First of all, there is the iframe, a hidden iframe that we put on a page with the URL of the function app, which is the URL here.
And Waldek, sorry, can we zoom in slightly, just making sure that it's understandable in the video?
There you go.
Excellent.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm getting old, so I can't see small text.
It's okay. I sit really close to the screen, so that's why I am on it. But nevertheless, I understand the request. There you go. Yeah. So here is the URL of the function app that we have. And the reason for us to include it in iframe is that whenever we include, let me show you what it does. If I paste the URL and I go back to the browser, and if I just paste it in a new tab, so now we are already signed in SPO. We can already access our intranet. And if I paste the URL, you will see that we are immediately signed into functions. Whereas if I open the same URL in private, I will be prompted to sign in, right? So because I am signed in, if I enter that URL in iframe, that iframe will directly get me cookie to this domain and sign me in. So that's why it is here. Then another thing that we do is we attach to this iframe an event handler. And we say whenever the iframe loads, set a flag to true. And this event occurs after the page loaded within the iframe. So in other words, after we got cookie for that domain in the iframe, in our page. And with that flag, we use that flag to wait with our AJAX call, for which we need to have cookie, to delay that only until we got cookie, right? So with that, we can just wait until we load the page, we got redirected from the login page back to the function page, and then we can have the cookie that we can use to call the API. And finally, we use a method here that we use actually in which we use that flag. So only until until the flag is not set, we wait, right? And we can wait for that for some time, right? And then once the iframe loaded, we flip the flag to true, and with that, we call the function that we pass here initially. So this part. And this part is nothing else than a default AJAX call with the SharePoint Framework HTTP client, and then with a GET. And herein we pass the URL of our function with a GET. And the tricky part is to include this one, to include this part here, credentials include. Yes. With this flag, you actually make the call, include cookie, and send that over to this cross-domain call. If you skip this flag, the request will break and actually be already blocked in browser. So you will not even be able to see it in Fiddler. It will be already blocked in browser. So this is exactly why that flag has to be there, because this is a cross-domain call that requires you to send over cookies to another domain, right? So that's why you need this part in there. And beyond that, that's just a standard AJAX call for which you will get a response that we get to JSON, and then we embed that directly on the page in our span that we have here, or actually in paragraph that we have here in web part, and that's how we show it on the page.
Makes a lot of sense. It's a relatively simplistic implementation on this side, and the whole scenario is actually super simplistic in the end to enable certain things to be aware, but that's it. So, and then on the what if it would be a web API? So in this case, we're calling a Azure function. You would have to do some level of a similar kind of configuration in your web API code. You would associate the web API to the Azure AD application, and then you make sure that you are setting the cross-domain authorization settings and all of that properly.
Yes. So actually, when you work with Web API, there is a package that you have to install in project related to CORS, and with that you can enable CORS for the API, and then you have to add attributes that basically say exactly the same as the function that we have here.
Yep.
Which is the if I can go back here to our function. So basically the same options as we have here, you can set using the enable CORS attributes on the API in code. Yeah. Right? So that eventually you will get exactly the same.
Absolutely. And as part of the documentation, we'll have that one covered as well, so people know how to make that happen, because that's super interesting as well. Obviously, Azure Functions, super awesome platform as well, but then there's clearly a scenarios where the Web API is used as well, so we need to cover both in our tutorials. Cool, but I think that's it for this one. So let's flip back on the presentation and talk about a few scenarios where this would be useful and why we are so excited around this being able to do this in practice. Good. So now that we've gone through what does it actually mean from a configuration perspective, let's slightly innovate. What does it actually mean? Why is this in quotes, the holy grail of enterprise development in SharePoint Online? Now, when we are using the SharePoint Framework, which is the client-side development framework for SharePoint Online nowadays, the model is essentially following. So we are hosting the JavaScript files somewhere in some CDN, and when you're accessing those within your browser, you are in the context of SharePoint Online. But the JavaScript files are hosted somewhere. They could be they could be hosted in SharePoint. You could use the Office 365 CDN or Azure CDN or whatever. But essentially, JavaScript files are loaded in the memory in the context of SharePoint Online. Now, using the model which you saw in the demo, you can then call in a secured way a web API or an Azure function. It really doesn't matter. You can call an external endpoint in a secured way. You're sending credentials and the API is validating those credentials, so the pipeline and that call is intact and securely done. And this means that the web API cannot be called unless the user is being authenticated, which is really the key point on this scenario. In a classic implementation styles or classic models, what we've seen in the past, we've kind of demonstrated these functionalities, but we never really went to the level of, okay, how do we secure that call? How do we make sure that from a client side and from a browser, when I'm calling the web API, that call itself is secure? And that's exactly what I saw today. And now the key point of this one is that this is unlocking then everything in Azure. Because when you're calling that web API or an Azure function, then it's up to you whatever you want to do. If it's a long-running operation, you can use storage queues, web jobs. You can do and access all of the services what we have available in Azure. It could be a hybrid solution. The web API is then using service bus to call an on-premises and then get some information from on-premises and calls back. And you've been able to securely access resources from on-premises and show them in SharePoint Online. And that is no doubt really, really, really super valuable scenario for SharePoint Online. And one thing why we're saying is that this is an enterprise development scenario is that this configuration has to happen in a way that the web API or the application which is hosting the web API or the Azure function is in the same Azure AD as the SharePoint Online. So that's a requirement for all of this to make work. So this does not actually work in the way that you would have a, let's say, a web API which is configured to be multi-tenant, and then that would not actually be then secure. That model wouldn't actually work that well, which is a pity. But then again, I think the enterprise developers and enterprise customers are really looking into these kind of scenarios to make, let's say, complex business processes to happen natively within a SharePoint Online in a secured way. Anything you want to add here, Waldek?
Well, I'd like to ask you two things. So first of all is, why would I care and why would I want to secure my custom APIs with AAD? Why not just use a function key or some other credentials, username, password, anything?
Well, the function key and the, let's say, username password way of securing on the SharePoint Online clients on the SharePoint Online side would essentially mean that it would be a configuration for the web part in SharePoint Online. So it would be, for example, in the properties of the web part edit panel, and you're able to secure that in a SharePoint Online. And yeah, that is kind of secure. There's, however, the concern that because SharePoint solution web parts are being executed in the browser context, what if there's additional web parts on a page? Theoretically, those web parts can access that information because the information is in the same context. When we're using SharePoint Framework, we're not using iframe level and domain level isolation. The execution happens in the same context of the other web parts as well. And I think that's probably the number one reason why this is more secure. And this way, you do not need to explicitly agree or to have a quote a secret or user ID and a password, which is configured on the SharePoint Online side for the call. You're essentially relying on the Azure AD as your authentication provider, and that's absolutely secure.
Cool. And would you be able to use the same approach to call the Microsoft Graph?
Can I use the same model for calling Microsoft Graph? Well, yes and no. So you could use it, you could call Microsoft Graph in your custom web API using, let's say, app-only access tokens. But to be able to call the Microsoft Graph, you would need to have permissions against the Microsoft Graph as well. So the execution would need to have those permissions. So you cannot directly use the exact same model within the user context call the Microsoft Graph. And for that one, we're looking into having more native support in SharePoint Online and in SharePoint Framework in the future.
Sweet.
Cool. Hopefully, you were able to understand the magnificent power what this one is actually enabling in the enterprise development scenario. So as an example, we actually got this model and the pattern from one of my ex-colleagues from Microsoft Services. I used to be a field consultant as well. And they're using this to show information in SharePoint Online, which is actually coming from their on-premises backend systems. So they have a web APIs hosted in Azure, and within the SharePoint Online, they're securely calling those web APIs, which are then using service bus or alternative methods to get access on the backend systems in on-premises. And then they use the identity of the user, because the identity, you got the identity, so the access, the account information. They use that to secure or essentially filter the information which is being returned to the SharePoint Online. So this way, you can have access on your on-premises services natively from SharePoint Online in a secured way, which is superb. And that's a holy grail of enterprise development for SharePoint Online, at least in my perspective. I don't know what you're thinking on that one, Waldek, in general.
It is great. I find especially the benefit that you don't need to have an AAD app for the web parts that you've built and to manage the URLs. That's probably the biggest benefit that you have, for the fact that you want to have an API that's capable of performing some either long running operation, complex operation, business logic, reaching out to external systems, basically anything that you cannot do directly on client, and to be able to all of that from within a web part in secure way without exposing credentials and secrets to clients, and also not having to manage all these apps and reply URLs, because that wouldn't work eventually. I mean, if you had a web part that's only being used on the homepage of intranet, that would work. But that's only one thing, right? And actually, the great thing is that web parts were actually meant to be used as building blocks for intranet, right? So to be used across the whole intranet and not just in one place. And for us, in order for us to be able to leverage that, we have to have the ability to use them whenever we want without having to request changes in AAD every single time we want to add a web part to the page. That would not work. So I think that this approach that we talked about here is really a great thing that actually empowers us to do that.
Yes, indeed. This empowers people to do much, much, much more in SharePoint Online than what we were used to do, used to be able to do in the past as well. And like mentioned when we started, during the webcast as well, there is a tutorial available around this one. Essentially follow up these steps and you can actually make a custom web part to happen, which is calling an external service. And we'll get up a samples around this one in the future as well to our GitHub repos. But I think that sums up the webcast for this time. So thank you, Waldek, for joining. Thank you on the great demo as well. And hopefully everybody watching the video are as super excited as I am on the opportunities that this will actually unblock. So thank you, Waldek.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.